It's lovely to see so many people here. I can see the numbers climbing up. Okay. That sounds pretty good. Okay. Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here in the virtual GleeBooks space. My name's James. I'm the events manager here at GleeBooks. And as always, it's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the shop, but also on behalf of Melbourne University Publishing. Before we begin the proceedings tonight, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also want to take a moment to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today, and recognise that it's upon the Gadigal people's ancestral lands that GleeBooks is built, and that it was sovereign land that was taken without consent, without treaty, and without compensation. For the settler Australians who are joining us today, I think it's important that we take a little bit of time to reflect upon that, what that means for us, and what we can do to help make that right. Now I'd like to introduce Andrew Fowler. Andrew is one of Australia's most highly respected investigative journalists. He's worked on the flagship current affairs programs of both public broadcasters. He's worked for, he's held senior News Limited roles throughout his career. And he first interviewed Julian Assange for Foreign Correspondent in 2010, for which the program won the New York Festival Gold Medal. He's just updated his 2011 book about Julian Assange, The Most Dangerous Man in the World, which we are going to be hearing more about today. We're really, really excited about that. And tonight, Andrew's going to be in conversation with Mary Kostakidis. Mary presented SBS World News nightly for almost 2 decades, and in 2019, she visited Julian Assange in Belmarsh Prison. I'm sure you're as excited to hear from them as I am. If anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask, I would ask you that you direct those questions to the chat. If you don't know where that is, you can just look to the bottom of your screen, which is if you look at the button just to the left of the green share screen button, and I think it goes without saying that we'd ask that you not share your screen either. But that is more than enough for me. So if everyone could, from the comfort of their homes, please join me in welcoming Andrew Fowler and Mary Kostakidis.
Thank you, James. Well, WikiLeaks founder and publisher Julian Assange has been in Belmarsh maximum security prison since April last year. He faces extradition to the United States, where he'd be prosecuted under the Espionage Act, charges attracting 175 years in prison. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have received scores of awards for journalism and human rights, including the coveted Australian Walkley for most outstanding contribution to journalism. And we're going to be talking about the most dangerous man in the world with Andrew Fowler. Andrew, the title is an acknowledgement of Julian's, among other things, of his impact. How would you describe that impact?
Now, Mary, I think it's difficult to underestimate the impact that WikiLeaks had when it really burst on the public scene in 2010. Who can forget being in the helicopter gunship hovering over that Baghdad square and seeing the people below and hearing the pilots talking as though it was like a game show that they were running, talking about lighting people up and then killing them, including 2 Reuters journalists. Now that hit home very hard around the world. And coupled with that, you had the release later on in the same year, and that was the collateral murder video, of course. You had later on in the year the release of the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and Cablegate. And it just ripped off the scab of what the Americans and their allies were doing in the Middle East. The torturing, the killing, the body count of people who died in Iraq. The UK and the US said that they weren't counting the dead civilians. They were. WikiLeaks revealed that 610,000 people died as a result who were non-combatants in Iraq alone. So That's part of the punch through that WikiLeaks brought to us all those years ago. It's a decade ago. And I think that when you look today and look back and say, what was the impact? I think that when The Guardian ran those stories, page after page after page of the atrocities that the WikiLeaks cables were exposing, as did Le Monde and other newspapers, and Der Spiegel. Journalists looked at those stories and saw them and saw the truth that had been hidden from us as journalists, maybe because we hadn't pushed back hard enough, also because governments have been very good at covering their tracks. But more importantly, it gave us a contemporary view of the world. We didn't have to wait for 20, 30 years to find out the truth of what our foreign policy colleagues have been up to. We didn't have to put up with the censorship. It was there, raw data, for you to make up your mind, and particularly for the readers and the viewers to make up their mind about what they thought. There was no filter in the way. No one stood in the way of this information. You could read the newspaper story, you could read the document, and you, the reader, could make up your mind. It was revolutionary. I think science called it scientific journalism. I mean, it may well be called scientific journalism, but really it's just journalism that the reader should be given access to as many people as possible. And WikiLeaks made that possible. And that was the big punch-through moment, as far as I'm concerned.
And of course, what allowed him to do it was the internet and his own commitment to social justice and his searing intelligence, really.
Yeah, well, his searing intelligence got him into a lot of trouble, as you'd appreciate, as people didn't appreciate Julian's searing intelligence. But some people at The Guardian weren't very happy with his searing intelligence, but his commitment to human rights and to disclosing unpalatable public truths were what drove him. And I think that we as journalists should be more supportive of him than we are now because of what he taught us.
And one of the reasons he's seen as such a danger, of course, by some powerful governments is because of the capacity for endless revelations. It wasn't like the Pentagon Papers where you have, publish, you reveal this, these terrible things that have been happening during the Vietnam War that were concealed from us. The fact that we knew the war was going to be lost. This was really having this capacity to upload anonymously meant that sources would be encouraged, and this might keep happening.
The major reason why the United States is persecuting Julian Assange is for that very reason. They don't want anybody to follow in his footsteps. They try not just to silence him, but to silence the idea. And we're also culpable, that's Australia as well, and the other so-called Five Eyes countries, in clamping down on journalists because of that very point that you make. And I think the idea of eternally revealing information in a contemporary time is extremely dangerous to governments. They don't want people to know what's going on contemporaneously. Also, Assange guaranteed he'd protect sources with an anonymizer. And so far, nobody has been exposed by WikiLeaks as a result of the information they've handed over.
You say in the book, in fact, that this is not true, that the constant assertion that his publications have hurt people, that people have died. In fact, you say WikiLeaks was on occasion more careful than the mainstream media.
Let me give you an example of that. I mean, let's go back to Collateral Murder, which is the gunship hovering over the Baghdad Street. I would suggest that any journalists around the world, there'll be few of them who wouldn't, if they're TV reporters, grab that video and put it to air, pretty much as you would, as you got it, once you established it was accurate. What WikiLeaks did was to actually send somebody, Christian Harafison, who's now WikiLeaks editor, to Baghdad to check out the veracity of that information. Now, I think that that's a commitment to public service journalism, the like of which we probably wouldn't see in today's modern age.
That's a very good point, because Julian, in fact, has been discredited because of this myth that he is not a journalist. Numerous myths, in fact, that have been attacks on his reputation, both professionally and personally. Another criticism was that he was holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy to avoid Swedish justice, to avoid the sex charges.
Well, sure. I mean, that's it's the beginning of the smear campaign, or maybe it's kind of, maybe 15% into the smear campaign. I mean, Assange told me personally that he believed the Americans would try to extradite him, and he was keen to stay out of the United States for as long as possible. And we now know that in 2010 there was a grand jury sitting, investigating, drawing up charges to bring him to America.
So they were the charges, because there never were any Swedish charges.
No, those are the
and
real.
Why were there never any Swedish charges?
Well, the real intent was to just get him in some way and to grab him. There were no, well, the charges were never revealed because the evidence was so thin, in my opinion. It's my understanding in Swedish law and extradition law that if you want to extradite somebody, and you must charge them once they get to the country. The problem is that Assange was being kept in the dark about the charges because there weren't any, because they hadn't gone through the process of gathering the evidence. And they didn't come to London with honest intent to actually investigate. Once they'd reached the stage of forming the charges, then they would have to then reveal just how thin the evidence was against him. And that's why the whole thing came to a standstill.
And during that time, those 8 years in the embassy, and since then, he's been the subject of a relentless campaign. Niels Melzer, the UN rapporteur, special rapporteur on torture, has been a tremendous advocate for Julian's predicament.
He has indeed. I mean, Niels Melzer is one of the great investigators of torture. He's spent 20 years investigating torture around the world. And Melzer, when he saw Assange, went into the embassy, he saw him, he said he was really psychologically being tortured. And he said also, I think quite crucially, that he'd never seen so many powerful countries gang up on one individual and try to destroy them. Well, it's quite extraordinary that the reporter on torture would say that about the United States, Australia, the UK, Canada, and New Zealand, and to say that they would gang up to put him away. And he thought that not only is Assange being tortured, he should be released and compensated. And what happened, of course, is that the British government said, this is wrong, we don't accept that, we appeal. So they appealed, and the United Nations investigated and found that Niels Melzer's findings were absolutely watertight and absolutely first class and right.
Andrew, another criticism is that he's been a Russian tool and that he's responsible for the election of Donald Trump. You say in the book that the revelation that Bernie Sanders was cheated out of the Democrat nomination should have further elevated WikiLeaks to the pantheon of great journalism.
Oh, it is, yes, Hillary. He's going on inside.
Sorry, somebody who's listening hasn't muted their mics. Can I just ask you, you're sitting at home or in this room, you haven't muted your mic, please do so.
Yeah, so they were saying that, and there's journalists in Australia as well that were saying they were quite angry because they supported Hillary Clinton and they thought Trump would be a disaster. Personally, I thought Trump would be a disaster as well. But had I been given those documents, had any journalist been given those documents which showed that inside the Democrat Party, Sanders was being stitched up and Hillary was being given a leg up for the presidency, I would have thought I would publish the documents. What journalist in their right mind wouldn't do that? And yet, such is the hatred of Trump. It blinds journalists to what their duty is, which is to reveal without fear or favour the truth that the public's got a right to know. And quite frankly, I think that even without that, Hillary Clinton would have lost the election. I think the party was so divided that when they treated Sanders was so appalling, and people knew it anyway outside. This was just confirmation. But it's another excuse to act.
You make it very clear in the book that you thought it was the principal thing to do. Let's move on from the myths about him and these assertions to some of the new material in your book that you've just updated. Tell us what you found out about the deal that Waldman tried to broker and the context of it and what happened.
Well, Adam Waldman, who's a rather interesting character, been described as being like Forrest Gump with a brain. He actually turns up at the most unexpected times, and he came up to the embassy, met with the WikiLeaks people, and brokered a meeting with a person from the Department of Justice, David Kaufman, who was head of counterintelligence. And they were having this backwards and forwards discussion about how to deal with the issue of Julian's confinement. And the Americans, that's the Department of Justice, were actually saying, well, what would Julian do? How would he help? And the discussion, as far as I understand it, went something like this, that Kaufman said, well, what can you offer? And they said, well, Julian would actually be able to say who was not the leaker. In other words, he'd probably explain what he said before, which is, it wasn't the Russian state and it wasn't the state actor.
Well, he may have even given some evidence.
And some evidence, exactly, but pointing away from, not pointing to sources, not reveal sources. And what happens subsequent to that is that the discussion had moved on to, well, what do you want? Well, Julian would be given free passage from the embassy. Will he go to America or not? That's the question. I mean, he probably thought it probably wasn't a good idea, but they were talking about those kind of things. And you then go back a few months to, this is in mid-2017, back a few months. And interestingly enough, the FBI director, Comey, when he learned of these negotiations, these discussions, said they should stop. This was relayed to Waldman, and Waldman through Luftman to Waldman, and they decided, Luftman said, we're not going to stop, we're going to go on. And they carried on. Because what was at stake here, as far as the Americans were concerned, was the release of documents called Vault 7, and they were the inside workings of the CIA. And they fell into two tranches. And the first lot, when they were released, caused not much of a flutter, but they were very concerned about the second lot. And so Julian has these documents that are extremely powerful and revelatory. And at that very moment, in the weeks leading up to the eventual release of them, there was a change of leadership in Ecuador. And the person who, the party was re-elected, that had helped him get asylum, but there had been a change of president. And the new president was very close to the Americans. The Americans were leaning on him. Pence had been there, the vice president, and the IMF had done a deal, and the Americans were then involved in their military. And Julian could feel the net closing. And he, as far as I understand, everything he's told me before, he believes in releasing for the maximum powerful impact. That's what he owes the people who blow the whistle and give him documents. And so he thought, I would say, net's closing, I've got to get this stuff out. And he did. And when he launched Vault 7, it did go like an exocet missile straight through the middle of the CIA, because it revealed, really crucially, if you unpick it, what it revealed was that the United States had been spying on China. The CIA had been penetrating Chinese industrial complexes, factories, and doing to the Chinese what the Americans say the Chinese do to them. So that was a crucial point. Pompeo went completely ballistic with former CIA director and accused WikiLeaks of being a hostile intelligence agency.
In fact, you also detail in the book the spying on Julian Assange and his lawyers in the embassy by the very party that's prosecuting him. So just take us through how this came to pass and the role of Cassandra Fairbanks.
Well, what's interesting is following that, you can imagine that things got a little tighter in the embassy. And an organisation called UC Global, Undercover Global, they're based in Spain, had a contract to basically run CCTV cameras, like you see around any large installation in Sydney, for security purposes, stop break-ins, things like that. Well, suddenly in about 2015, they started installing cameras that could record sound inside the embassy. So, another question. And also microphones. And they recorded conversations between Assange and his lawyers in great detail and funneled them back to Madrid. And then through a special splitting of the computer server, they gave one lot to the Americans and the other lot went to the Ecuadorian government. And so the split that went to the Americans gave basically a complete 24-hour rundown of everything that happened inside the embassy. Now, who the Americans were is not clear to be able to say exactly who they were, but by piecing together the information, as I've done going through passing many pages of transcripts I can remember, you can see that the information made its way all the way to the State Department. And how do we know that? Because, woman you mentioned before, a journalist called Cassandra Fairbanks, she was an interesting character. She'd actually been a Bernie Sanders supporter. And then when Bernie had been so badly treated, she jumped across to Trump. And of course, the Trump camp welcomed this, this refugee from the left with open arms. And so she had great contacts with the Trump campaign, including a guy called Arthur Schultz, who's rather, I think it'd be kind to say, rather abrasive to the media, has been described as a head kicker. And so she got on very well with Arthur, and Arthur would talk to her. So when Arthur told her things, she then told Julian, because she was a great supporter of Julian Assange. And when Arthur learnt that she'd been talking to Julian, he was less than happy and told her so, extremely unhappy. You've told him all these things, I can't talk to you anymore, I can't trust you. The question is, how did Arthur know that she'd been talking to Julian? He said, by the way, there's a big investigation of the State Department. Some people, my best friends, are under a microscope. How did he know that? How did he know that she'd been talking to Assange and what she'd said? The loop has been closed. It's the State Department had access to the information. And what's significant about that is that if the State Department has got access to it and they in any way alert the prosecution to that information, then the argument can be had that the whole case falls in a heap because it's illegal in the United States, I understand, certainly in Europe, to spy on clients and their lawyers. There's a really important point about the relevance of that information and who had access to it.
Well, a lot's going to hinge on British justice, and so far it hasn't been promising. We saw during the hearing earlier this year that Julian was barely able to communicate with his lawyers, and indeed all along he hasn't been able to prepare adequately for his case because of hampered access to lawyers, even to documents he needs to read for his defence.
Yeah, indeed. And I think the problem with the case, I mean, many different problems with the case, including, as you say, Assange not being able to talk to his lawyers, not being able to sit in the court world, being held in the cage like some sort of, I mean, Belmarsh prison. This is the UK's Guantanamo Bay. They were locking people up there, in the early 2000s. He has a problem of dealing with the US, so the UK justice. There's a slip for you. The UK justice system, because the UK justice system is not behaving justly. How can the judge who presides over the entirety of this case, how can she preside over it? That's not the person at the hearing. that the person who's actually the head of it, Lady Arbuthnot, she is related to a member of the House of Lords, her husband. He sat on the Security and Intelligence Committees in the UK. He had a business relationship with the former head of MI6. And according to the rules and regulations that govern which cases you can and can't sit on, she's in complete breach of that. She should have nothing to do with this case.
Yes, she's compromised, but also the Office of the Prosecution in the UK compromised themselves, and we know this because of the FOI documents that Stefania Maurizi obtained.
Well, they did indeed. You're referring to the Swedish case. Yes, well, it's a rather curious matter, isn't it, when the Swedes are pretty much losing interest in the case, mainly because of the internal criticism that the prosecuting authority in Sweden's coming under. And according to the FOI documents discovered after great work by Stefania Maurizi, who's an Italian journalist, that in those documents she discovered one piece that hadn't been blacked out. And it was simply said, it was a message from the British, from the Crown Prosecuting Service to the Swedes saying, don't get cold feet.
Don't you dare get cold feet, I believe.
Thank you for correcting me. Don't you dare get cold feet. What is happening here is that the British are only too keen to get Assange into Swedish custody.
Well, that there was pressure from the UK on the Swedes. Yes. Just moving on, because we've got a lot of material to get through. There's a new indictment now, but no new charges.
No.
And it wasn't served to the court. It wasn't served to the defence. It was served by the media. What do you make of this?
Well, it seems to me that the problem here is that the Americans realise that their charge in which they accuse Assange of helping Chelsea Manning get access to a computer system that she had access to legally anyway, was so thin and so vulnerable because there was no offence really committed there. There's no offence of encouraging Chelsea Manning to break in and do something she wasn't entitled to do. It was to help her hide her identity. So that was the most important thing. I think that these charges now are stepping back from that and saying, well, look, if we don't get that one off the ground, then what we'll do is we'll say he stood in a hall and he asked questions of people and said, if you find information out about the Americans and what they're up to in here, there, or anywhere else, or the British, or the Australians, or anybody else, or the Russians, please get the information and give it to us on WikiLeaks. So that was what he was actually doing. So they're accusing him now of conspiring and encouraging people to hack computers. It shows to me that this first charge that he was actually held on when they dragged him out of the embassy, after, by the way, after he had exposed the spying, it was within 24 hours they dragged him out. So it strikes me that that's what that's about. It's a catch-all. It's catching up with the failed first charge. It's so weak. And I think that that's a sign of just the weakness of the case. The problem is that just how low, just the little evidence that's required to get him to the United States. You don't have to prove the case to get him there. You just have to show there's a case to answer. And that is a problem, because if Julian Assange ends up in the United States, I think he will be in grave trouble. And 175 years isn't what we're talking about. We've got people there that wanted to, if Biden wins the election, he called Assange a high-tech terrorist. I mean, the hatred for him will be palpable, and the country, as you can see, is so divided that I don't think it would be possible to get a fair trial, not even in Virginia.
Andrew, you and I and others can see that there's been a relentless unfolding of an injustice here. Yet our Prime Minister says Julian Deane should face the music. And I want to ask you, why do you think the Australian government is taking this decision? And what should they be doing?
Well, he's not alone, by the way, in saying that Julian Assange should play some music. If you go back to 2010, Julia Gillard said that he'd broken the law to the extent that they called the federal police in. Federal police investigated and found that he'd not broken the law. Now, the Attorney General at the time said, I'll take away his passport. And Kevin Rudd said, well, you don't have the right to take away his passport. And by the way, if Assange needs some material to help him in his prison cell, I'll send him a computer. And that's because, this is Rudd actually supporting open government, more open government. And he actually lost quite a bit. WikiLeaks reported a lot of stuff about what Kevin Rudd said about the Chinese, which was extremely embarrassing and unpopular. But having said that, he still stood by Assange. If you then roll on to later on, Bob Carr, who's now become somebody who says, enough's enough and Assange should be brought home. He was saying that he thought that, Assange had received more than enough consular assistance, more than usual. And then he said, no, I didn't actually say that. That was because I was getting sick and tired of Christine Assange and I wanted to just basically, pay her out a bit. I mean, what is this about? As the foreign minister saying this about somebody just to settle an old score. Then we roll forward to the current incumbents, and we've got Scott Morrison saying he should face the music. And the question is almost redundant. Most people would know the answer. The reason that it's like that is because Australia is so close to the United States that it's terrified of offending the great master. It's horrified, and so it will do anything not to offend them. And Assange is like, he's out there, let's not worry about it. Let's hope the public will forget about him. If the public forgets about Julian Assange, I think they'll live to regret forgetting about him, because I don't think that he will survive if he ends up in the United States. And that will be on the hands of the people, not just the public, but the politicians who need to understand that the public does support Assange.
So what Maurice Payne, our Foreign Minister, is saying is that he's receiving consular assistance. He gets the sort of assistance everyone else gets in this situation.
Yeah, well, consular assistance is really just, as you said before, it's like issuing your passport. It's helping you find your lost train ticket. It's get your stolen bags or whatever it is. This is not a consular assistance matter. This is a political matter. The government needs to talk to the British, particularly Boris Johnson, who says the extradition relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom is very one-sided. Without going into details, they've got their own problems with other extraditions that they want to bring people back from America and they can't do it. So that's what you need to do. It's a political decision where this government says it's a political prosecution, and therefore we believe that you should not send him to the United States on the basis that it's a political extradition, and under the terms of the treaty, I understand that you can actually make that argument to say as a political crime you shouldn't be extradited.
And Australia has intervened in the past. They've helped James Ricketson, Peter Greste, Michelle Corby, who you talk about in the book. So if it was a drug runner, we would have sent over a couple of QCs to help.
Well, that's exactly what happened with Michelle Corby, and John Howard did do that on her appeal. But the difference is that on one side, you've got Asia and our neighbours, and this is where we really punch down. This is where we flex our mighty muscle in Asia. We feel emboldened to stand up and speak truth to power. We can deal with that. Can we deal with the United States of America? Absolutely not. Absolutely. We just go to water. I mean, it is extraordinary to see a country so craven to another power. I migrated to Australia many years ago, and I was told of the great strength of Australian character and spirit, and all those things. With the United States, forget it. Forget it. We just give in, whatever they want.
Andrew, I think we've both been disappointed by the failure of journalists to see that Julian Assange has been a canary in the mine. A failure to comprehend the implications and consequences of his persecution and his prosecution. We're seeing the disturbing rise of authoritarianism in Western liberal democracies, with governments are enforcing this new social contract, which they've snuck up on us. How is it affecting the role of journalists and more broadly our freedoms?
Well, that's a very good question and quite a long one to answer. I'll just make a point that Daniel Ellsberg made about 2010, and he was talking to Julian about these issues of Assange believed that if you could expose the rottenness inside organisations, that they would collapse under the weight of their own criminality. He's a great believer in that. And what Daniel Ellsberg said is, on the contrary, what will happen is they will get tighter and tighter, worse and worse, harder and harder, and more authoritarian. It'll be just the reverse. You need to fight against that and be wary of it. But what we've seen is just that. Ever since WikiLeaks, ever since the exposés of 2010, it's become more and more draconian, more and more authoritarian, and harder and harder and harder for journalists to do their jobs. The government in this country has introduced, there was no protection for journalists. There's a protection implied in some of the charges that may have to pass through the Attorney General, and he may or may not, or she may or not decide to prosecute. There are certain certain small things that you might be able to argue in court, but it's up to the court to decide whether or not you're protected. It's absolutely hopeless. There is no real defence. And when you see what happened to the ABC, where the federal police just went in the front door and started rifling through the files of the ABC. This is the ABC, this is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I mean, this is an Australian institution, and the federal police are going in and just looking through reporters' notes. I mean, this is extraordinary. This is absolutely extraordinary. And the ABC, to their credit, I mean, that they pushed back and they fought back. But this has been slowly eroding, and journalists have been too willing to give up, too willing to give in. The ABC, for example, got their hands on several filing cabinets of ASIO documents. And ASIO said, we want them back. What did the ABC do? They gave them back. I can barely believe I'm saying this to you. No journalist will hand back classified or confidential documents until they've been through them and until they've worked out whether or not the public has a right to know information contained in those documents. So the slippery slope, the slide that's coming all the time, ends up with the feds going in the front door and rifling through your files. So the resistance is not too late to resist this, but it's increasingly difficult.
Andrew, I think we better take some questions from people who are watching now. Okay, lots of questions. Andrew, does the Democrat presidential win offer any chance of Julian's prosecution being stopped?
No, not at all. It's one and the same thing. There is no difference. The only difference would have been Sanders, but he was marginalised and pushed out the door by the establishment. The Democrat Party, I think, although I'll tell you, I hope that Joe Biden wins. But as for Assange, I think there's no chance of any change. He's the guy who called Assange a high-tech terrorist, out there banging the drum. I mean, you can see there are more wars coming. I mean, I think one thing about, I'll be brief, about Trump is that he actually reined in John Bolton. Pretty good going, I think. I mean, he took Bolton as a last resort, but he did at least stop him from some of the more insane acts he would have carried out. America would be involved in more wars if Hillary Clinton was president. I'm convinced of that.
There's a question about discussing further the global precedent being set by the prosecution, I think they mean, of Assange for press freedom, especially in the light of the threat to prosecute ABC journalist Dan Oakes for exposing war crimes in Afghanistan.
Yes, and so what's the question?
So, well, the prosecution set by the precedent set by prosecuting Julian Assange. If the US can prosecute someone for committing a so-called crime, not on their, not in the United States, and can have them extradited, not a United States citizen, no crime committed on US soil, have them extradited, prosecute them, and put them in jail till they die. It's a death sentence, really.
Yeah.
What's the significance of that precedent? I mean, couldn't they then extradite the Guardian editor next to?
It's a warning to every journalist. In fact, it absolutely is that if you report something that the United States of America decides is not in their national interest, is actually and maybe uses information that they consider to be classified secret, they can extradite you. They can attempt to extradite you. And that has a chilling effect on journalists to actually have that fear hanging over them. And that's the reason why the Assange case is so important for journalists. If you don't get it, if you didn't get it before, you must get it now. That you're next. But of course, Russ Bridger is not being prosecuted.
The raids in Australia happened straight after Julian was dragged out of the embassy. And David McBride tweeted the other day that he was aware that Australia consulted the United States before taking action against him and Dan Oakes.
That wouldn't surprise me, because that's exactly the intermeshing of the intelligence means that if you're pulling the threads of the intelligence apart, you'll find there'll be threads of American intelligence involved in that story, almost certainly. And consequently, that is a risk. Yeah, I mean, there's a risk, but also we would tell the Americans, because Australia uses so much American intelligence, so much of the hardware that's used to suck up information is American control. So they basically have the copyright over this stuff, a lot of it. I'm not sure of the breakdown, but the majority of it, and the hardware particularly, is American. So you can see which way the wind is blowing if you're a journalist. I would encourage people not to take any notice of this whatsoever, but to go and do their jobs. But I know that people higher up the command chain will be thinking seriously about bringing on another raid at the ABC, because there's a fear, and it's designed to instill fear in everybody. Censorship to censor us, to stop us knowing. I mean, for goodness sake, can you imagine what's going on right now that we don't know about, when we knew about what was happening in 2010, 2007, only 3 years ago? I mean, they don't want, that's the United States particularly the current administration, do not want to have their dirty linen washed in public.
There's another question here about the Labor Party. What's Albanese's Labor Party doing now? Do you think anything's going to change if Labor are in power after the next election?
Probably not. I wouldn't think so. Labor Party just sticks very closely to the script on intelligence and security, even when it's completely vacuous, bonkers, and serves no purpose. They just stick with it because you can't criticise the United States. It's impossible, and it's such a dud way of thinking, of not engaging. You just say nothing. You just follow on slavishly. So, if we end up with the Americans deciding they're going to launch some kind of a cyber attack on Taiwan or on China, we'll be part of it because we're so enmeshed in it. We're so enmeshed in American foreign policy.
Someone else said that they're interested in further discussion on the Australian government's response. Could we talk about the difference between the way the Australian government reacted to the detention of journalist Peter Grester in Egypt and the reaction to the Assange situation. Of course, they have an excuse, a facile excuse with Gresta because it's Egypt, and they can write Egypt off as a country where you have to protect your citizen against human rights abuses.
Well, it comes back to the same thing again. It's the same thing. It's a country that's not that powerful, so consequently we can lean on them, and the Americans will probably help lean as well. But if Peter Gresta had been picked up in the United States for doing good journalism, he would still be in the United States. He wouldn't be free. And I think Peter Gresta needs to understand that. The journalists stood up for him, and they put themselves out to support bringing him back to Australia. And what Peter Gresta did was to write a column saying that Julian Assange was not a journalist. Now, the importance of that is that without Assange being a journalist, the Americans were prosecuting successfully under the Espionage Act. The thing that stands between Assange and prison in America is his journalism. He has First Amendment protection. It's not guaranteed, but it's as good as you're going to get. Without him being a journalist, there is not much protection left. And I think that journalists need to think very clearly before they say that Assange is not a journalist, because it's a death sentence, potentially.
That's a very, very good point, Andrew. And also, it's about the changing role of journalism and how, who is a journalist, particularly today?
Sure, who is a journalist? I mean, many years ago, it was if you earned half your money as a journalist or as a writer, you could be a journalist. But now people are journalists who publish material. So there are many more journalists than there were before. Are they publishing material for the public interest? Yes, then they're journalists. If they're gathering information to give it to a foreign power, then you can prosecute them under the Espionage Act. But Assange has never done that. Assange has always published. He's published material. He's a journalist.
And he's authenticated. WikiLeaks have gone to a lot of trouble to authenticate material. They've never published anything that's not genuine.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Authenticate everything and publish what you know to be true, which is pure journalism, which goes back to the wretched Hillary emails, and that's to do with, were they authentic? Yes. Are they in the public interest? Yes. Publish them. That's what we do.
Yes, and the most important role of journalism to hold power to account. Because if we're not doing that, then...
Well, not holding power to account. We've managed that we're earning a lot more money working for a large organisation that wishes to silence journalism. And there are many of them. And you may work for a government, for example, who will pay you a lot more money to misrepresent the truth, and to journalists who haven't got enough time to check it very often now, than you would by being a journalist struggling to hold, as you say, in that cliche, but I think very accurate description of journalism, holding truth to power. Because unless you're doing that, what's the point? Why bother? Why bother being a journalist unless you're doing something like that?
And another question, Assange's lawyer, Joel Deane, has become the French Foreign Minister or Justice Minister? Justice Minister, yes. And we know that France is a country Assange was seeking asylum in. Are the two events connected?
Well, I think that probably Julian Assange would wish they were, but I think that he got the job because he was rather an outlier. I mean, he's offended, this particular chap, offended both left and right in France against the Me Too movement, but wants to see Marine Le Pen's party criminalised. So he's got, so Macron's picked him. But the upside for WikiLeaks is that he'd actually campaigned to get Assange brought to France. And I think that, if there's an upside to it, then that's it. And you'd be happy to have at least a friend in court rather than an enemy in an adjacent country.
I want to ask you another question about something you said earlier, Andrew, and that is where we go from here as a society, because if pressure is going to be on journalists and media organisations to self-censor, and then what you're saying is that someone outside, an independent, like Julian Assange, by doing what he's doing, he is making governments go harder to control the narrative. Or how is this resolved? How is this going to be resolved? What's the way forward so that we can have a fairer society? I mean, there will always be these tensions. There'll always be these tensions. We're just moving to an extreme, though.
Well, I think that the question about security and national intelligence is, it's clear to say there are some things that, and not many, and Paul Barrett, who was previously Defence here, he said there were a handful of secrets that need to be kept secret. Most of the stuff that's out there, and most of the stuff that WikiLeaks produced, was at a secret level, which is, by the way, not a very high level. But governments wish to control every single piece of information. And the problem with a weakened media, because of the way that the internet and Google and Facebook have destroyed the model and advertising has been sucked away, they can't hold governments and powerful organisations to account the way that they should. How we actually get ahead of that, you have to have a system to support public broadcasting, which is why the cuts on the ABC point the finger directly at the way the government wants to run. They want to run down. They're delighted that newspapers are shutting. They're delighted. They can then put their press releases out and have them read on the net. There's no one standing in the way. They'd like to run the ABC down and run it out of town and run it out of business, and then they'd have complete control. I mean, there'd be some in the Liberal Party, the National Party, who would say, no, that's not true. No, that's absolutely not true. But the ideology is to destroy all questioning opposition. And just by the way, to point the finger at China and Hong Kong is a little bit rich, considering what's been happening with Assange and failed to stand up for somebody who does hold truth to power. The answer to your question is, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that by having robust, healthy, open discussions like this and talking about these issues can actually make people think about what kind of country they want to be in and to wrestle with those problems.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think we also need leaders who are big enough to say, you know what, I think that was a mistake. I think we can do things differently. Yeah. And with the courage to stand up to our allies. Because we don't have that.
No, we don't have that. We don't have that, but we're about to see America, maybe not disintegrate in my lifetime, but it seems to be pretty wobbly at the moment. And how are we going to manage this sort of step away from engaging with China? Australia just needs to be more independent. And as Hugh White, a passing jab at people who want to be more independent, said words to the effect, well, if you want to be independent, you're going to have to pay another 2.5% of your GDP. Well, I don't know, that's part of the debate. Do we want more independence so that we're not involved in foreign wars? In foreign wars with the British, in foreign wars with the Americans, or in a foreign war with the Chinese? I mean, that's the sort of position you've got to get to engage the public and talk to them about the honesty of where we stand here.
And understanding why we enter foreign wars is so important. And many of WikiLeaks releases enable us to do exactly that, as Participant Fernandez has summarised so well in his book, What Sam Wants, which really gives us insight into American foreign policy and how Australian foreign policy is linked to that. We need, as the public, to understand all of that. Look, thank you very much, Andrew. It's been a great discussion. I wish there was I'm sure people listening wish that there were other questions that could have been answered, but I think we're going to have to stop it there. Good luck with the book. I hope that the launching of your updated book is going to focus on this very, very important issue, but not just personally for Julian, but also for us as a society.
Thanks very much, Mary. Thank you.
And I also wanted to just say a very quick thank you to you both for an absolutely fascinating session. Everyone, if you would like to present.
Come on, fire! Get your notebook. There's more.
Boss.
The Most Dangerous Man. That's the title of the biography of Julian Assange, written by veteran investigative reporter and TV correspondent Andrew Fowler. Andrew has just launched his updated version of his 2011 book. We've just heard Andrew in conversation with Mary Kostakidis at Glebe Books in Sydney. We are pleased to have Andrew Fowler joining us now. Andrew, welcome to CNLive.
Hi, Joe.
Andrew, thank you for joining us. After your long conversation with Mary, there were plenty of questions answered, but I can assure you that we have some more. I'd like to just start by asking how you got onto the Assange story to begin with. Were you a correspondent in London at the time when his case with Sweden was happening, when he went to the High Court and then the Supreme Court?
No, I was working for foreign correspondent in Sydney, and I was investigating the crash of an Air France plane in the South Pacific. And I saw this new website, which was promising that it had some documents about the various manuals that pilots used, and was there some conflict between the Airbus manual and the Air France manual. So I contacted WikiLeaks, and we made a contact there. Then came the collateral murder video, and I realized that this was a very different kind of organization. We made contact with Julian Assange and interviewed him, and I made a program for Foreign Correspondent as a result of that.
When was that Air France crash?
2010, I think, or 9.
Was it hard for you to get your editors interested in this story? And how has that changed over time, the editor's response to your interest?
Look, I mean, I must say the original story wasn't that easy to get up as an idea, because it was a little abstract. That was the Foreign Correspondent story. But once we engaged the editor, he was very keen, and it got a good run, and they put resources into it. So I mean, that was fine. I mean, in fact, Assange has been through that whole thing of being, extremely popular and winning, dozens of awards and being heralded as a great savior of journalism to now, by at least some accounts, being treated like a pariah.
Well, that's what I want to ask you. Did your editors in the last few years, for example, you were able to update this book. Was there any difficulty in getting Melbourne University Press to do that? No,
none whatsoever, Joe. In fact, they were very, very keen. In fact, they rushed me to get it out as soon as possible. And, I was working, trying to do 20,000 words and tell this story. And so I don't think I did. So I've just lost the screen. I've got this thing across right across the top of it, which means I can't.
It's okay, Andrew.
So it's it was very much embraced by them, and they put a lot of resources into it to get it out. They really he's a Melbourne person. I know the Melbourne University Press, I would say without speaking out of school, think that they support the work.
The problem with updating a story like this is it's constantly moving. I mean, you could already add another chapter right now, perhaps. And I'm referring to the superseding indictment, which Mary mentioned. I have a specific question about that. They're trying to set him up as being someone who directed hackers to hack, as somehow committing a crime. Now, Robert Perry, who founded Consortium News in 2010, wrote a piece about Assange in which he said, and of course, Bob Perry was a great investigative journalist who broke many of the Iran-Contra stories. Bob said that he would encourage his sources to even commit a small crime in order to to prevent a larger crime. In other words, he would ask them to break their non-disclosure agreements to leak classified information to him. In this case, what the government is saying is that there were maybe two crimes once, that Assange encouraged hacking, and then the classified information was also given to him, and he's an unauthorized person. In your view, is this a crime to encourage or direct hacking?
No, I think, Joe, that the first charge that they brought when Assange was dragged out of the embassy was quick, and I think it was weak. And I think they realized how weak it was, because what he was doing was what any journalist does, to protect the source. So when Chelsea Manning was trying to access the computer, but to hide her identity, to access material that she had every right to get to, what Assange was doing, if this is what happened, in my opinion, is to actually help her hide her identity. So what they've now done is realizing that that's not a very strong argument. They've now widened the net to include basically just standing up in a hall and saying, I reckon you should give material to WikiLeaks, or encouraging people to talk to journalists and to talk to WikiLeaks, which is much lower, but it's a much easier get into America. And I think all of it is about one thing: to get into the United States. I think the other stuff, the espionage stuff and all that, yeah, that's okay, but they really just want to get in there, and that's why this thing has been changed. The charge hasn't been changed, but the definition and the explanation of it has.
Well, the funny thing is about the Espionage Act is that they only have them on a small part of the act, which says that no one is allowed to possess or disseminate classified information, including you and me and anyone else listening and watching. If they retweet or email a WikiLeaks document that's still classified, they have also possessed and disseminated classified information. It is something that should be challenged as unconstitutional, but it's still in the Espionage Act. That's the narrow crime that they can get them on. But they didn't bring that up yet, at least in the first week of the extradition process. They have only talked about this idea that Assange was involved in the hacking, and also the informants issue, which I could bring up later, that he so-called endangered their lives. But the fact is that that's why I asked you whether he indeed broke a law by just asking someone to hack something. And he was protecting Chelsea Manning's identity, his lawyer said in open court, because she was downloading music videos and computer games that were forbidden to American soldiers to have. It wasn't even that she had helped him get classified information, which she already had legal access to.
Yeah, exactly. Look, I think that's the issue you raised really is about the implied, and this isn't something that's not really understood either. You made a very good explanation. The implied protection the First Amendment gives journalists. It's not complete. It's an argument. And what you're saying is they're running a very narrow definition about information being shared. But if they're going to prosecute Assange, they have to prosecute the New York Times. They don't have to. So this isn't about equality. This is about silencing somebody who stood up and spoke out and didn't play the game according to American rules, which is that if you work for the New York Times, you get a story, you run it past the Pentagon first. You don't just broadcast it. The Guardian had this problem when they published material from Assange. They had problems in dealing with that issue because the FBI was saying, you can't say that. And the Pentagon was saying, you've got to come and talk to us about this. And the Guardian said, well, we're not an American company. We're actually, we're based in the United Kingdom. We don't have to. So they then published material. So, that was the argument, not with Assange, but with Greenwald and the Snowden papers. So it's a very narrow line. I think the protections that the journalists have in America are allowed, provided they play by American rules, which means that you don't publish material without first running it past the state. And Assange objected to that.
Elizabeth.
Thank you. Andrew, in your book, you write that in the turbulent aftermath of the Vault 7 disclosures, the belittled United States turned its full attention and power on destroying WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And I just wanted to ask, to what extent would you say that you see global spying for the US relates to WikiLeaks publication of Vault 7? Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, look, I'm not sure, it's a good question of the direct connection there. I think that they did not know about that until later. I think that they knew about, obviously they had, why Assange released the Vault 7 documents at that time. You'd have to say that the change of government in Ecuador would be an important point, and he would be thinking that time was running out. He also, in the back of his mind, was Comey trying to stop the talks. between Waldman and Kaufman. And so I think that he was thinking, if I don't get it out now, it may all go, it may all disappear. So you see, it wasn't until the extortion attempt in April of 2019 by some employees of another security company, not the ones who did the spying, but the other guys, trying to stand over WikiLeaks for €3 million, that they realised that they'd been spied on. And in fact, they then went back to London, having got access to these documents, held a press conference. Within 24 hours, the Metropolitan Police had come in the door and taken Assange out. So the connection is more to do with the extortion attempt and then the revelation that they are being spied on, WikiLeaks is being spied on, and the action then by the Ecuadorians and the Metropolitan Police.
Switching gears a little bit on Goose for Two and the DNC leak, DNC hack, you explain it's unlikely that Goose for Two was the source of the DNC emails published by WikiLeaks. What do you make of Goose for Two as a persona? Do you have any opinion on who or what interests may have been behind it?
I mean, you can speculate about Goose for Two, but I think that any organization that puts its hand up and says, we were responsible for the leaks, it's either a disinformation system or it's being run by people who are clowns, basically. I mean, and what did Goose for Two actually reveal? A few bits and pieces, material that I think my recollection is that when they wrote to the Republican Party and said, what do you think of this stuff we've just released? And they said, not much. I mean, it was all third-rate stuff. So I think that, yes, they were up to no good. They may well have been Russian. They may well have been, as the FBI documents and charges say, they may have been working, may have been Russians, may have been working out of Russia. But whether they were the source for the documents, the Podesta files and the Hillary Clinton files, I don't know. I'm more inclined to think that, I mean, it's possible that Craig Murray, the ambassador who pointed out that it's possible that it was an inside job. I mean, he says that, that John Podesta, who was working for the Saudis at the time, as well as being chair of the DNC, would have been a target to check on him, to see what he's up to. And that it might have been, might have been a Bernie supporter inside the CIA who decided, I've had a gutful of this. I don't know. But Goose for Two struck me as being a bit of a sideshow, but up to no good. Did the Russians interfere in the US election? Certainly. They certainly did. I find it a little bit strange for the Americans to be upset about a foreign country interfering in their elections, quite frankly, from Australia, because it's happened before, not only here but elsewhere. But I think that that's an area that will eventually, I suppose, be revealed. But I can't say more than
that. Andrew, on just one other point on Goose for 2.0, WikiLeaks has stated that they use none of the material that he provided to them. It could be that they already had all the material that Guccifer then duplicated by sending it to him. Do you think that's possible?
No, I believe that they may well be telling the truth. They may well not have got the information from Guccifer too. I mean, it seems that's the conclusion that I've reached, but it's not a full picture. I mean, it's possible that WikiLeaks is lying, but from what I can see of it, they're not. I mean, it's possible that Craig Murray is dissembling and is not being straight, but from what I can see of it, he's not. So you kind of work these things out on the balance of, where you might go. I mean, there's a whole investigation to be carried out here, and there's not enough time in the present circumstances. Time is of the essence right now because of the impending extradition hearing in September the 7th. But certainly, it would appear that it's not the way that the American establishment is painting the picture, from what I can see of it.
Now, you said that Assange was offering evidence that it wasn't Russia, but not who the source was. I'm not sure how he could have done that, but also, why do you think Comey tried to shut this down?
Good questions, Joe. I don't know. I don't know why. I mean, look, you can speculate about it. He certainly believed that WikiLeaks was a Russian actor of some description. He said that in his book, right? That's what he said. What he said, right? What he said he believed. Why he came in and said, cut the talks out, it may well have been because, look, I mean, it's just be speculation about this, that if Julian Assange was going to point away from Russia, that's not what Comey wanted.
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
I'm sorry, go on.
No, that's possible, but, you know, I just haven't got enough information to form a conclusion on that.
Right.
You know,
why did those talks eventually fail? Because Comey wasn't listened to by the men involved in the negotiation.
Well, I think they failed in the end because Assange was worried about Ecuador, about being bounced out of the embassy because Morano was going to come in, and he was, you know, he was on the same party as Rafael Chiara, but he was certainly to the right, and he was certainly in the thrall of the Americans, from what we can see. And he had this extraordinary cache of information, and I think he was frightened of losing it, you know, frightened of losing control. And he harkened back to Comey saying, you know, bang, we're not going to talk to him anymore, you know. So it's happening at a much lower level. The negotiations going on between Justice Department, although the guy was counterintelligence, head of counterintelligence, Luftman, sorry. So it's unclear, but certainly, if I was in his position as a journalist, I'd be going, well, we've got this great story. I guarantee impact. Someone's risked everything to give this to me. I've got to honor that part of my agreement. I've got to get it out there. And of course, when it came out, I mean, it was explosive. I mean, it's just extraordinary what it revealed. You know, the antivirus companies that say this is like Kaspersky and the others, they say this actually shows the fingerprints of attacks on Chinese companies and systems. And this is coming from the CIA. They identified it like a virus, you know, bang, that's it, same one. So that gives a lie to the whole argument that, hey, China spies on America, China spies on the United States, but we don't spy on them and we don't steal their secrets. Well, I mean, it's naive to say that we don't, but it's really interesting to actually have the evidence that we do.
Absolutely. Love to go on that, but I want to take you back to the superseding indictment, which unfortunately came too late for this first update. This superseding indictment talks about Sabu, who they name in this indictment as a FBI informant.
Yeah.
We learned from a extremely interesting Rolling Stone article, which focused on teenager. That's how he's identified in the superseding indictment, who we now know is Sigfrid Thordarson. And Siggy's story was that Stratford files were given to WikiLeaks from Sabu when Sabu was already an FBI informant. That worried Siggy to the point where he thought that was breaking the law. So he contacted the American Embassy in Reykjavik, and then he himself became an FBI informant. My question to you is, was this an FBI sting operation? And it failed, obviously, and they gave up Stratford's files on purpose to try to entrap Julian. Is that what you think was going on?
It's possible. That's a very good piece of analysis, Joe. I think that they would do anything to get him, and this double sting operation, absolutely right, because they're going to have an explanation as to why he actually turned the way he did, and the actual consequence of that is that they've got this guy, which I think is kind of questionable, the evidence that he gives. But again, you know, I come back to this thing. It's not about prosecuting the case. It's just about getting Assange to the United States. So although it's wonky stuff and questionable, it's enough to persuade the judge. And, you know, the judge that oversees this whole thing is deeply compromised. I mean, look, I'm not happy saying these things about a judge, a UK judge, but I just don't see how this judge can sit over this case when the relationship she has with the intelligence community and Parliament, it's too close. The case should not go ahead. The case should be thrown out now on that basis alone.
Yeah, and her husband had stuff revealed about him in WikiLeaks, I believe. But in support of what you're saying is that they just want to get him to the U.S.
Yeah.
The fact was that I've lost my train of thought. Sorry. The fact is that this looks like a sting operation because they were able. Oh yes, here's the timing of that sting operation was right after the Obama administration decided that they weren't going to pursue the Espionage Act indictment because of what they called the New York Times problem. That if they were going to get Assange on espionage, they'd have to also indict the New York Times, who published the same material. So it seems to me that once they gave that up, they moved to plan B, which was to try to get him on computer intrusion and him aiding that by being a so-called director of the hacking. And yet the issue remains whether that is illegal or not altogether, whether a journalist can ask someone to commit a small crime, even hacking or any crime, but does not participate in the hacking himself, which there's no evidence for. And this superseding indictment does not say Assange did. So I just wanted to make that point that it was right after they dropped the espionage thing, which of course the Trump administration went forward with. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'd like to just return to the discussion you had earlier with Mary, where you kind of described the draconian state tightening its grip around the last vestiges of real journalism in Australia and the US. In this environment, do you think that the WikiLeaks model can really survive going forward? Or from another perspective, is it the only answer kind of that we have left in the independent journalism sphere?
Yeah, look, I think the WikiLeaks model is everyone's copied it. Everybody puts out on their web page, drop your secrets here and the rest of it. So that can never be undone. And I think that that's one of the great services that WikiLeaks brought to journalism, was to protect your sources in the internet age, to actually use the internet, the thing that can actually trap you and track you, to actually allow people to be anonymous and to anonymize their drops. And so sorry, the second part of the question, what was that?
Well, just that, is this something that can survive going forward, or is it kind of the only way that independent journalism can move forward?
Yeah, I think it's one of them. I'd hate to say the only, but the problem that we have is the thing that Ellsberg pointed out is that, Julian is a great sort of crusader and a great, thinker of what might be possible. He dreams of what might be possible. Who can understand that somebody in 2007 was dreaming of an idea of doing what he did, and it worked? It's an extraordinary event to come out of Melbourne. You ever been to Melbourne, you know what I mean. So it's a really amazing thing to come out of Melbourne. And I think that the problem is that the greater you push, the greater the pushback. And that's what Ellsberg was saying. And so you get to a point where it fractures. And I'm not full of hope of fracturing countries. I don't like revolutions. I don't like changes taking place on a catastrophic level. But if you keep on driving people into a ditch and keep on pushing back against what I think is democratic right to public interest journalism, you will eventually get a revolt. And it might not be a revolt that will suit even journalists. But this is unsustainable. You can't have a powerful executive controlling all information. And that's unfortunately what we're heading towards, which is what Ellsberg pointed to. So that's a potential catastrophe. But the idea that you can silence people by intimidating them is, I think, a failure of faith in humanity. Assange was prosecuted to stop, and Manning was prosecuted to stop Snowden. They prosecuted Snowden to stop the next person. You can keep on doing this. If you teach people, young people in America, the United States, the Constitution is what we stand for. These are the things that make us American. And you then send them out in the world and tell them the Constitution doesn't matter. You're about listening to executive government. They will rebel against it. And that's the hope. That's the hope for the future. They will rebel against tyranny and do what is their democratic and decent and journalistic right to do. That's what I think the positive conclusion with this would be.
One of the things that's so disappointing about many news outlets that have kind of tried to copy or implement WikiLeaks' secure Dropbox is that many of them have ended up burning their sources, sometimes repeatedly, in a way that WikiLeaks has not. So I think that really is disappointing. But so in your opinion, in this, your book really just demonstrates the role of the Trump administration, obviously, in aggressively prosecuting Assange in a way that exceeds the Obama administration. But yet this doesn't really get covered in the press, and not just the left-wing establishment press, but also the right wing wants to see Trump as sort of like bringing Assange over to maybe testify about Russiagate and all of this. How can we get this through to a larger audience that Trump is actively going after Assange in a way even Obama did not, and that it has nothing to do with justice or exposing, corruption to do with Russiagate, et cetera, et cetera?
You can think a number of things about Trump. You can think he's either an evil genius or an evil egotist. And I think that it's really simple, and really too awfully simple. It is that whatever Obama did, he will undo. Whatever Obama did not do, he will do. So it's like hairy-chested, macho nonsense, playing with our lives and our world for his personal whim. It's just appalling. The Department of Justice decided not to prosecute after the 2010 grand jury investigation, and they made a decision based on the way that the Constitution works in America, the way that you balance these things out. Sometimes it's not all right. I mean, New York Times buries the NSA spying story, all that sort of stuff. And, but you kind of get it right. He came along and said, they didn't do it, so we're going to do it, proving his macho sort of credentials. I think it's truly as appalling as that.
Joe.
Andrew, you mentioned rebellion against tyranny in the US. We may have seen that this is beginning already. It goes beyond race, I think, these protests, particularly the destruction of symbols of tyranny in these statues. And you also said about going to Melbourne. Unfortunately, the border is closed. I hope that doesn't affect the books getting out to New South Wales. This is, of course, because of the virus. I wanted to bring you back, if I can, or bring you into the bunker, The Guardian, where The Guardian had set up with Assange there in London, a nerve center to publish the Cablegate. Mark Davis, I'm sure you know, a colleague of yours, a Australian journalist now and a lawyer as well, says that he was there, of course, doing a documentary, and he says that it was, in fact, only Assange that cared about redacting the names of informants, and that he stayed up the entire Friday night, did an all-nighter before publication on Monday to remove some of the names in the first batch that was going to be published, and that the Guardian editors and the Times did not really care about that. And also that Davis says the New York Times set a trap for Assange, and that they were going to be publishing that Assange released the documents first, and that they were just going to report, even though they were partners, report that WikiLeaks had revealed them. And of course, we know WikiLeaks had a technical problem, whether that was real or not, whether Assange was being cagey there, then that the New York Times did publish first, in fact, but they reported that WikiLeaks did. I know because I went back and saw the article they reported. It wasn't true. I wanted your take on this. Do you see it the same way Mark Davis did?
Look, I think Julian Assange did try to redact, but the truth is WikiLeaks did also publish some material that has not been seen. He told that to Daniel Ellsberg and promised he wouldn't do it again. And I think that was a low point. I mean, that was a problem. It was so much a problem that the British press went looking for the people who had died as a result of this disclosure on the Afghan war logs, which is what we're talking about, I think. And they looked a lot. The Times, I recollect it was, found a dead body. They found someone who had died. The problem with that particular story was the person had died a year earlier. That the publication of the names of people that are being published without actually being seen, which Assange recognized was wrong, told Ellsberg that. There were no dead bodies, there were no problems. And we now know, historically, that I know these arguments about whether or not Julian was there, whether or not the documents got out and the rest of it, the New York Times and the timing, all that. I mean, it obscures the basic fact that there was an error made. We all make mistakes, no problem. Did anyone die? No. How do we know that? There were 2 reports by the Australian Defence Force looking at Afghanistan and looking at our soldiers there. They found nobody had died. The Pentagon, during Chelsea Manning's trial, investigated all of WikiLeaks documents and said that nobody had died as a result of that exposure. So this is a bit of a, I mean, to me, it's a bit of a dead end argument because really the great good that WikiLeaks has done always gets picked at by this one thing. And basically, even when all the documents were dropped on the internet, they weren't dropped by WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks did not drop all of its documents. What happened was David Lee, the investigations editor of The Guardian and a first-class journalist, wrote a book, came out slightly before mine. And one of the chapter headings was the cipher code that unlocked the documents. Lee says he didn't know that these documents were locked by the same cipher code as the ones that he'd used. So he publishes this thing, and Die Freitag, a German newspaper, publishes the code. Daniel Domscheit-Berg was the courier of that information to them. They then published it, and people started dumping the information out on the net. Assange, within a few hours, say 2 or 3 days, put out all the documents in WikiLeaks' name as well, saying that he felt that his people that follow WikiLeaks, should have access to that information rather than it being scattered around the world on various different servers published by other groups who use the David Lee passcode. I mean, I think that that's a problem. I mean, Julian Assange should have just let it stand there. He said he was protecting people by warning them. Okay, maybe he was also behaving like a journalist who didn't want to be scooped as well. Whatever the reason, Assange always has to answer that question about you dumped all the documents on the net. In fact, he was second to do it. He wasn't the first person to do it.
Yeah, well, that's interesting that the Times understood that if they published first, they could be liable to prosecution, although I think it's unlikely that the government, at least now, would go after mainstream journalism, because mainstream journalism is on the side of the state for the most part. And Assange certainly isn't. He's doing the job that journalism is not, that corporate journalism is not doing.
No, that's right. But the point you make about the Times is that they did wait to get the, to see the other side take the heat, if you like. And the thing is, it goes to the heart of the issue, which is that the American newspapers were, they have a relationship. They're protected by the First Amendment, but they don't actually really, very often, the NSA stuff with the New York Times. They run to the establishment to ask permission to print it, and that's the deal. Right. You get protected. Whereas what Assange was doing, and this is where it broke it open, he was saying, we're going to publish this stuff and it links straight to your webpage. So you are publishers of this material that hasn't been run past the Pentagon. And right. That was a significant point.
Yeah, the question of the informants is really a red herring for 2 reasons, I think. One, because as you say, Robert Gates said, and I think General Robert Carr, I believe, they've stated that no one was killed because of the release. And number 2, if you look at the indictment, the Espionage Act indictment, there is no statute at the top where they list all the statutes that are supposedly broken for revealing the name of an informant. It's a crime to reveal the name of a covert intelligence agent, but it's not, as far as I know, even a crime to reveal. It may be unethical, but it's not a crime to reveal the name of the informant. So I find that whole issue, but the indictment has so much of about that in there that it seems, Andrew, if you agree with me, that this is what's called window dressing, just a PR move, basically, to smear Assange, first as a rapist, as we know is not true, and secondly, as a guy who was so cavalier that he didn't care if people died.
Yeah. Absolutely right. I absolutely agree with that analysis. And the smearing has been going on, well, for a long time, and we now know through other documents, of course, released by WikiLeaks from 2007, 2008, which was a army counterintelligence unit talking about how to deal with WikiLeaks and how to destroy the center of gravity, which of course means to smear Assange. And it's been going on for now, 12 years or 10 years plus. how you undo it, going to the other question about how you actually undo this stuff and bring people back on side, is very difficult. But I think that programs like this and discussions like we had here this evening help to have a broader discussion about how executive government needs to be dealt with, an increasingly executive government dealt world. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little a bit husky.
Oh, that's quite all right. Listen, I have 2 more questions, but I'm going to turn it back to Elizabeth now.
All right, I just wanted to ask you in general about your views basically of Assange and WikiLeaks and whether they've changed with in the years between initially writing your book and now revising it and updating it. And if so, how have they changed, or have they just kind of solidified for you?
Well, my views have, I think, probably solidified now that Julian Assange said to me years ago that this was they were about to try to get him, to drag him to America. And one of the infuriating things about Assange is that he is so often right. And so he's so often right about pointing out what the end game is. What he didn't understand was that his theory that information would make us free had a few transit points to go through. One of which was getting past the people with the keys to the gates, and that's the problem that we're going to deal with as a society. Now, I just have to say, by the way, that this bookshop's been very kind to me tonight and is allowing me to talk now for quite a while, but they are kind of keen to go home pretty soon. Just to point that out, I must apologise, but it's getting very late here.
Okay, Andrew, I will just close it off by. Well, I'll skip. I was going to ask you about UC Global and the Arthur Schwartz role, and Rick Grinnell. I happen to have known Grinnell when he was the spokesman for John Bolton at the UN, where I was a correspondent for 25 years, and he was not a very pleasant character. He called me and other journalists up on the phone to chew us out when he didn't like a question we'd asked. But I'll skip that unless you want to. Unless it's time for you to answer that, and just finish by asking this: you've written 2 books about attacks on journalism, in addition to the Assange book. And I just want to know if you think that the Assange arrest opened the way for the raid that you mentioned with Mary on the ABC, and that is now leading the Australian Federal Police to ask for the arrest of these 2 ABC journalists in the David McBride case. That, of course, is publication, very much like WikiLeaks, of evidence what appears to be war crimes possibly committed by Australia in Afghanistan. It happened 7 weeks after Assange's arrest. June 5, and he was arrested June 11. Do you think that Assange's arrest opened the way, made it easier for the attack, for this Australian attack, direct attack on journalism?
Well, I think without doubt, the increasing pressure on journalists and the increasingly hawkish positions of government and their political enforcers, without doubt, connect those 2 dots. That Assange being dragged out of the embassy would have encouraged anybody who was doubting about raiding the ABC, because in this country we actually have a very right-wing Home Affairs minister and a very right-wing bureaucracy in that particular department, and they would have taken great delight in seeing what happened to Assange, and it would have actually emboldened them to do that. This was a long time going for a major institution like the ABC. But it would have definitely, I think, put wind in their sails. These decisions aren't made without context. They're not made without, particularly with Assange, without having some other motive, or his arrest or his activities causing people to react here in Australia, to play the game, if you like.
Well, thank you, Andrew. In fact, I understand that the AFP asked for the fingerprints of those 2 journalists on April 1, 10 days before the arrest. That probably was a green light, it seemed to be. Andrew, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us. As you say, you've had a long night there. I want to also thank Mary Kostakidis for her interview of you previous to this. And thank you, Elizabeth Voss, my co-host, and our audience for listening to Andrew Fowler talking about his updated biography of Julian Assange called The the most dangerous man in the world. Thanks again. And you've watched CNLive. Goodbye.
Get out your
Thank you,
notebook.
Andrew. Terrific.
More.
Thanks.
Let you go home now.
It's the guys here.